Hi, thank you all so much for being here. I am so excited to be able to give a talk at this conference that I've admired the content from afar for so very long now. And also, just in case anyone is a little curious and minimize awkward conversations later, I am in fact 7 months pregnant. It is not just that I ate too much butterbeer ice cream yesterday at the studio tour, but at the Harry Potter studio tour, but it's cool. So yeah, this is like baby's first public speaking event. Very cute. So what I am here to discuss is basically my favorite frame for examining differences in communication style. I call it a culture clash sometimes because those clashes can lead to tension, especially in the workplace. And so that's something I'll be trying to cover during this talk as well. I think a lot of times, like, people can be very clear communicators, but only for like-minded people. And I figure most of us, we want to do better than that. And we want to be clear communicators even with folks that are different from us in some way. So let's jump in with an example. So here's what's up. Let's say this is you, and this is your friend, Jamie. Now, Jamie has a friend that you've never met named Taylor. Taylor is going to visit your city and needs a place to stay, but you would rather not host a stranger, understandably enough. And yet your friend asks you, can Taylor stay with you? What's your instinctual reaction in your head? Not out loud, just in your head. Is it, oh yeah, no big deal, I'll just tell them no? Or is it something more like, oof, this kind of puts me in a difficult position? Now, if you had that first reaction, that is ask culture. And if you had that second reaction, that is something that I would characterize as more on the guess culture end of things. So that's just a really quick litmus test. Quick show of hands, who identifies more with ask culture? Okay. And then who maybe is more on the side of guess culture? Good to know. And yeah, exactly. And if there are folks out there that may not be sure, that is totally fine as well. We'll talk a little bit more in detail about each side of these things. So this is kind of a brief outline of the different topics that I'm going to covering. We just did this litmus test here, so now I'm going to jump into just a broad overview of each of these cultures. So as far as I can tell, this ask versus guess culture description first came up on an Ask Metafilter post in 2007. And the way it's described there is, in some families, you grow up with this expectation that it's okay to ask for anything because you're totally okay getting no for an answer as well. And so this is known as ask culture. In other families or cultures, you try to avoid asking unless you're pretty sure that the answer is going to be yes. And that the way you know if the answer is going to be yes is that you put out these sort of like delicate feelers out there. And if done well, you won't even have to ask, you'll just get an offer. And so this is another description that someone pointed out to me, that it could also be described as offer culture versus guess culture, which I like also as a neutral description of these differences. The thing is, once someone makes an offer, there's still kind of a little bit more to it, which is that you have to use your judgment. Were they just being polite? You want to make sure that you're not imposing on others. Because ultimately, there's a sense that putting others in the position of having to say no to you feels a little bit rude. There was a talk at the Lead Developer New York edition a few months ago that we watched at work it was titled, "Congrats, you're the tech lead, now what?" So I totally recommend this talk. It was really, really good from Erin. And one particular section I thought helped illustrate this difference for me as well, is she talked about making sure to try to perceive the need. And this was key. She said, you need to try to perceive the need so that people don't have to be rude and ask you for help or for the thing that they need. And I'm always noticing examples like this where it comes up of just like, oh yeah, like this person is totally operating in this one particular kind of culture versus something that I might do in that instance, for example. So this is really a spectrum, not a dichotomy, even though I use the word versus here. Let's say that computers are at the furthest extreme, where you have to spell everything out exactly, right? Based on my own experience, different regions in the US, for example, are at different points along this scale. I am from the Northeast, and it ends up pretty far here on the left here on Ask Culture. One thing I've noticed is that places that have a really strong reputation for being really nice tend to be more on the guest culture side of things. And so this plays out globally as well, where some countries seem to have a culture of being really direct, like Germans, probably. If there are Germans in the audience, they usually agree with me on this, while others might be more indirect, like in Japan. And so definitely individuals vary. This is not about stereotypes. These are just kind of some patterns that I've observed. After the last time I gave this talk, someone introduced me to that Twitter account, Very British Problems. So let's stick the UK somewhere along here, right? All right, so again, even though I frame this as versus, I really want to make sure to emphasize that I'm only describing this in terms of comparing and contrasting, and not that one is better than another. Because just because you're more comfortable with one doesn't automatically make it better in all situations for all people. And I feel that we all have responsibility to make sure that our messages are received by others, and that those others might be different from yourself. From a practical standpoint, even if you sort of secretly think, oh, it would be so much better if everyone just operated the way that I do, just again, from a very practical standpoint, I think this is very useful for understanding the other side and, again, getting your message across. So let's go through a couple more examples. This first one came from a Medium piece I read a few years ago about something the author called the Seattle No. I have also heard this described as a Facebook maybe or a California yes. So, there's quite a variety here. So it goes something like this. Hey, I'm going to the party. Do you want to come? And if the other person says anything along the lines of, oh, that sounds interesting, I'll have to check. Or maybe something like, oh yeah, maybe. And then you never hear from them again about it. This means no. And the point that I am trying to make is that this is not necessarily obvious to all of us. So here's another example from my personal life. Normally on the weekends, my husband and I each cook one big meal to have leftovers for the upcoming week. I was thinking through my weekend, and I said something along the lines of, yeah, I don't think I have time to make lunch for next week, because I was just talking out loud of saying like, oh yeah, I need to figure something else for that, which he interpreted as, could you make some extra meals so that I can have lunch? And then so he says, I'm going to cook 2 meals this weekend. And I'm thinking, all right, that's kind of weird, but okay, whatever, it's up to him. And what I do not say is, oh, you don't have to do that, which is what he would be expecting me to say if I wanted to refuse this offer and I had seen it as connected at all to that we were, he thought we were having one conversation. I thought we were just exchanging statements of fact of some kind. So, as an end result, at the end of that weekend, I'm over here thinking, why do we have so much food in the fridge? And he's over there thinking, I'm such a good husband. He is, but, it's good for me. So now I want to talk a little bit about the pros and cons of each of these cultures. And again, my aim is to be fair as possible to both, given that I definitely lean towards one side more than another. So on the ask culture side of things, I think it really prioritizes efficiency in knowing exactly where you stand, because there's very little ambiguity, there's no interpretation needed. And sometimes you can also consider that it maybe transcends nationalities. But one thing to point out is that people who are guest culture do in fact feel like they have clearly expressed their wishes, even if it is not explicitly in the words or vocabulary that they used. You also tend to get what you want, or at least in the short term. But if you end up asking for lots of things, it can come across as feeling a little confrontational, and it can end up making people feel a little uncomfortable, even alienate them at times. Guest culture, on the other hand, I think very much prioritizes avoiding hurt feelings or embarrassment from direct confrontations. It is generally considered more polite, and it's very expressive. You say a lot because of all these items that are really implicit in there. Guest culture, however, I think really depends on this tight net of shared expectations. You have to be able to recognize these subtle signals that people are sending and receiving. So this is maybe not great, like folks for me that are not necessarily always great at reading those social cues. And I think depending on location as well, there might be different assumptions across different types of guest cultures maybe. For example, from the Midwest to the South in the US. And so the thing is, if people don't share those expectations that you have, I think you can end up feeling like no one is listening to you at all. So one way to think about this as well is if we sort of roughly have a sense of a charting request granted versus explicit verbal requests. On the guest culture side of things, there's sort of like an extra component in the denominator here, where there are all these implicit requests happening as well. So one thing to note is that if a guest culture person actually very explicitly asks for something, it's a really great idea to pay attention. It's a pretty big deal, and it doesn't happen all that frequently. So if there are folks out there who still aren't quite sure which side they might lean towards a bit more, kind of questions of why is anyone the way that they are at all? Probably we have some innate preferences molded by family, molded by larger cultures and contexts that we're in. For example, I have a friend from Vancouver, Canada, who describes that place as a very diverse city with many different cultures who do not have that history of shared expectations. So you may very well end up being one way at home, and then kind of in interacting with the rest of the folks in your giant city have to resort to a different kind of communication style. Companies as well also have different standards and cultures. I'm told that Intel, for example, at least at one point, was extremely strongly ask culture. People won't ask you if you need help, you have to bring it up. Startups, on the other hand, can be much more loose in terms of processes because they're smaller and people just know each other better, again, with that tight net of shared expectations. Remote work, on the other hand, I just started at Heroku a couple months ago, and the thing with that, of course, is that body language and facial expression are very much a huge part of communication and interpreting what message people are sending. So that's a consideration there as well. Even within a team, I think we can have sort of like a microculture amongst a particular team sometimes, especially in areas where managers have a lot of latitude and depending on the team size as well. Because ultimately, culture is a word for how we do things, and there's tons of variation on that, of course. Maybe even people have strong personal experiences that push you one way or the other. So for example, my parents are immigrants to the US. And if you just think about the kind of people that will strike off onto a foreign country on their own and knowing very few people in this new location, I think that can end up affecting the way that they raised my sister and me as well. So speaking of family, I do want to point out that one thing I often hear folks say after I discuss these ideas with them is something along the lines of oh yeah, my mom is just like that, or my mother-in-law, it's so hard to tell what she wants. And so fairly anecdotally, I have this observation that women seem to be socialized to be more guest culture, even within a broader ask culture preference. Women tend to be socialized to be more accommodating, less confrontational. There's even this thing I've heard about called the Girl Scout tax, which is that women are expected to be more helpful than otherwise. And so with any kinds of these sorts of things, if you don't personally match other people's expectations, you can end up meeting with a different reaction. So for women, it's that thing where you can end up getting labeled as abrasive, but also on the other side of things, for men, who if they are not extremely on the ask culture side of things, and people are expecting that, then these quieter men can end up getting labeled as timid instead. So I think the thing really to keep in mind here a lot of times with interacting with other folks is that I really believe that people are doing the best that they can with the methods that they know how. If you still can't categorize yourself, you probably lean guest culture because you just don't want to tell me no, one way or the other. But another aspect is that I feel like a lot of ask culture folks tend to recognize this frustration in not understanding what other people might want. And in my case, for a while when I started working, would literally get in all of my performance reviews, "You're very direct." So that was a pretty clear signal to me there. But again, it can also be a matter of context because, again, you might be one way with your family, with your shared history and understanding, and then a different way with your friends or at work for how you get particular kinds of tasks done. So different styles can be more appropriate for different situations. For example, some situations are like when you're not quite fully sure about the relationship. So if you think about it, in an interaction with a stranger, that tends to be much more brief, transactional, less long-term concern about the relationship there. And then, on the very other end from that, people that know you really well, they get you, and you may not have to be as concerned about these boundaries and whatnot. And it's really a lot of these folks in between in this sort of like iffy gray zone. Sometimes I talk about it like you make friends at work and then you're just kind of like, do they like you as much as you like them? Like, have you made the transition into like outside work friends yet? It's just a little iffy there. I'm planning a baby shower for not too long after I get back, and like the RSVPs are surprisingly high so far, so I think that's pretty good. But hopefully people will feel comfortable and come and have fun still. So anyway. A lot of these things, we want to make sure not to cause anyone embarrassment, right? So let's talk about some strategies for handling ask to guest situations and vice versa as well. From my own personal life, we can definitely live in harmony, I think. My husband and I have been together for over 10 years now. And I'd say that generally speaking, it's really about trying to step a bit more into the other culture so that your message is clear and people are comfortable both. And I really think that overall, now that you can at least recognize this difference, you're most of the way there. So if you're from ask culture, my number one tip is to make a guest culture friend who can serve as your guide and interpreter. So this is what my husband Dan is for me a lot of times. I get confused by some interaction, I'll bring it home, and he'll help me dissect it to see what was being said between the lines. Sometimes I'll even send him difficult emails that I'm trying to write and hash it out on will people react in these other ways? Or I'll reread my emails of my own and see if there are nuances that I didn't pick up initially and try to continuously improve that way. Remember that it is not just what people say, but what they don't say as well. Because you might not have heard a no, but it wasn't an enthusiastic yes either. So pay attention when there's any hesitation there. Last on this slide, ultimately, go ahead and just apologize and clarify later if you realize too late that what you said may have been misinterpreted, that you sent out a guest culture signal that wasn't what you intended. If you're from guest culture, every time I practice this presentation with my husband, he's always like, Guest culture people don't need to hear this. They already understand all these things that are going on. You don't have to be so explicit about everything all the time. But I also dislike the imbalance from it's like I have one slide for one, so I need a slide for another, right? So we'll go through a couple. The first thing is that I just want to remind folks that people might just be unaware of the rules, and I think that can help alleviate some of the frustration of oh, how could they do such and such a thing? Because there's an assumption there that you're operating on the same playing field, and those folks may not even be in the same arena, right? Consider as well that softening a no with an excuse can end up hurting folks as well. And I know that since this is a primary concern, I think this is a good point to remind folks that we want people to be comfortable, and if they didn't understand that what you were saying was a no, then you haven't quite accomplished that goal that is a priority for you. So now I want to talk a little bit about how this frame applies to work situations where this culture clash might come up. Some general things to consider are that we have lots of short-term goals at work, but we have to remember the long-term effects on relationships as well. It's like investing or like letting technical debt linger and be ignored, these things that are a little bit under the surface. As always, it is all about relationships. I think a good rule of thumb is to try to be a bit more deferent until a relationship has been established, because when you have that friendly relationship, people are just much more likely to interpret what you say in a favorable light. Because people just, oh, that's just Kei-Wu. She wasn't saying that you need to hurry. She was just curious about where you were at to see if she could help. I think it's also good to try to check in at times outside of when you need something right then and there, again, to establish that baseline of we're all on the same side and we want the same thing. I like you like me, everything's good. Another question to ask yourself, I think, is how much are you assuming based on what you think you heard? And it's good to try to assume that you don't know necessarily what it is that other people are thinking. Because a lot of times I go into a situation and I end up realizing afterwards that I made a mistake because I just assumed other people would react in the way that I do, which is not necessarily the case. And there's no reason as well to assume that people are necessarily unhappy with you. So try not to continually second guess yourself, even if people just mention things once. Right? And then I have some friends who are like, oh, there was just one comment and they're very concerned about it. And I was just like, oh, no, it's fine. We can let that go. So some useful phrasings here are things like, oh, hey, I have a question, but it's totally OK to say no. That's what I do a lot of front on. I try to remind people in the moment, it's OK to say no to me because I'm totally OK receiving that. Thanks to my guest culture friends, I have some improvements on here. So, they can use this phrase exactly as is, or they can say things like, it's okay if you're busy, or I understand if you're busy, kind of giving people that out already ahead of time. And kind of encouraging communication this way and not holding back just because you don't want to interrupt someone. This phrase here is something that happened with a friend of mine who wanted to ask for a raise after she'd gotten some new responsibilities. And in talking it over with her beforehand, she actually had gotten feedback in her last performance review recommending that she be more assertive. And so I suggested that she use phrasing along these lines as a callback to help herself encourage to set that conversation up of, she actually is following along. This is not out of the blue, and it's exactly what her boss had asked for. And it totally worked. She totally got a raise out of it. So it was really awesome. Yeah. One thing I think as well, especially again in establishing new relationships at work, maybe with every new manager that I have, I think it's really good to talk about communication styles up front. And I just tell my managers I need to hear these words pretty literally and directly at times. So for guest culture people, maybe their manager, for example, has a goal for them to participate more vocally in meetings. And so maybe in that one-on-one environment, if they're comfortable, they could say something more along these lines, it would really help if, so some suggestions there to help make progress towards meeting that goal in a safe way. You can go ahead and use this talk as an excuse. For example, I went to this amazing talk at the lead developer, right? And the recordings will go up shortly, I'm sure. So a couple more example situations. In the situations of giving or receiving help at work, I think that this is pretty important here. Again, I think that it's something that's great to discuss with the team, to have a conversation about it before that urgent situation necessarily comes up. You can talk about methods of interrupting, frequency of checking in, how much time you should let yourself be stuck before asking for help in some way. And then again, you have that there to be able to reference back to that conversation. This was an interesting conversation on Twitter from a few months ago, I thought, for talking about how you can make it easier to ask for help as a junior developer. So this was an interesting aspect of this to my thought of how office layout and expectations around open versus closed doors in offices might have an impact here. Sometimes something like this might come up, something like, I'm not sure I understand this feature, because someone is saying this hoping that people will see that you don't understand and step up to offer help. And so what this really means is, can someone help me? In your particular situation, I think you're just going to have to judge whether this is effective or not. Are you getting those offers for help? And if not, it could very well be that people are missing those signals and you may want to try a different tactic. On the other side as well, just because no one has specifically said, this is not working for me, again, reading between the lines, that doesn't necessarily mean that everything's okay. You can ask questions about this if you're not sure in a very gentle sort of way. So, we can just say, do you have any questions for me? So this is okay, it's giving an opening, but it might be even better as, what questions do you have for me? Because it doesn't have to, people don't have to introduce the idea that they might have questions at all. You're just assuming that and making that opening there. I also like this where we can offer up several options that people can then choose from versus having to do a black and white decline or accept. And also when making these sorts of options available, you can be extra enthusiastic when you're offering. This particular situation, though, with an Ask Manager and a guest culture report is something to be particularly careful about, I think. It's really good to constantly remind folks that they can say no when you ask them to take something on, and giving that positive reinforcement of, oh, thanks so much for reminding me about these other items that are on your plate. Let's figure out another solution that will work better for the team overall. One thing to be very careful about is that if you reverse a decision without enough explanation, though, folks might end up never saying no to you again, even if you want them to. I think it's good to take a look at processes that you have, not needing to default them to where people have to ask for things necessarily, because it can end up penalizing some folks. So for example, rather than having a fairly clear conference travel policy of this number of conferences with this budget each year, if you instead had a policy where people always have to bring it up themselves and make a proposal, that might end up not distributing as evenly as you might hope for. And so, remember that if you have a report on your team that is mostly guest culture and rarely makes a direct request, but then they do, very much make sure to pay attention to that. There's this workplace advice column that I really love it's called Ask a Manager, and she wrote a column here where she said that a lot of people assume that if their boss is assigning them a ton of work, there's no point in speaking up because they must be expected to find a way to get it all done. when in fact, the boss is assuming that they'll speak up if it becomes a problem. And so you end up in this situation where the boss is thinking everything is totally fine, whereas the employee is sort of stewing and feeling a bit overwhelmed about their workload. And so I think this is yet another example of that dynamic playing out and something to keep an eye out for. Just a bunch of other things. I don't have time to cover them in depth, but I put in some links. This idea of publish versus poll managers, working with folks that aren't native speakers in the language of communication that you use, retros and things like that as an opportunity for this to come up, and formats of messaging, just calling someone directly versus an asynchronous method of communication like Slack. The last item over here in work situations is really to try to use your strengths. So for example, in meetings, if you're a guest culture type person, maybe enlist an ask culture type person to help advocate for your point of view in a more confrontational setting. On the other side, sometimes I try to step in when I know certain situations might need a little bit of a different approach. Really, overall, just try to be thoughtful, help each other, carve out space for everyone to be able to feel comfortable and, again, get their message across cleanly. And so, finally, if you ever have any questions, please just ask. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you.